Millionaire goes to the hospital and runs into his ex with a baby who looks just like him. His reaction says it all, but before we tell this story, subscribe to the channel to follow daily stories. The sun beat down on Fifth Avenue as William Thompson stepped out of his gleaming black Porsche. The respected corporate tower that housed the headquarters of Thompson Enterprises reflected the midday light as if announcing the empire he had built in just 15 years of relentless work. At 42, William was the epitome of New York business success, determined, ruthless, and obsessed with results. "Good morning, Dr. Thompson." The building's security guard greeted him with deference as he walked through the lobby with confident strides. "Good morning, Sergio. Anything new?" William asked out of politeness, already checking notifications on his state-of-the-art phone. "Nothing special, sir. The legal team was waiting for you for the 10 o'clock meeting, but it's been rescheduled for after lunch." William simply nodded and headed toward the private elevator. He had more pressing matters to attend to before the meeting about the company's expansion to the northeast. His biggest project yet, a luxury resort in Maui that would set a global standard for sustainability and opulence. Nothing could interfere with this deal. In the spacious penthouse office, his assistant Olivia was already waiting for him with a worried expression. "Did something happen, Olivia?" William asked, placing his leather briefcase on the mahogany desk. "St. Clair's Hospital just called. There's been a change in the schedule for the sponsorship contract signing. Dr. Henry suggested you come by this afternoon to finalize the details before the official ceremony." William took a deep breath, visibly annoyed. St. Clair's Hospital was a key piece in the image he wanted to build before announcing the expansion to Maui. The multi-million-dollar sponsorship contract for the new pediatric wing would be the perfect crown to his social marketing strategy. "Reschedule my agenda. I'll be there at 3 p.m. The afternoon came quickly. William drove his own car to St. Clair's Hospital, located in an upscale neighborhood in the southern part of New York. As he walked through the sterile, bustling hallways, he greeted doctors and nurses with a rehearsed smile. That hospital represented more than just a contract for his company. It was an opportunity to show that Thompson Enterprises had a social conscience. As he turned down a hallway leading to the executive offices, the sound of a child's laughter caught his attention. He instinctively stopped and glanced toward the waiting area of the pediatric wing. For a moment, his heart skipped a beat. Sitting in a blue armchair, cradling a baby in her arms, was Emily Carter, his ex-wife, the woman he had loved deeply, but had separated from 2 years ago, after 7 years of a marriage that had worn down between arguments, diverging ambitions, and the frustration of not being able to have children. Emily was wearing the white lab coat that marked her role as a pediatrician. She was thinner, her brown hair shorter than he remembered. Time had been kind to her, William thought, feeling a pang in his chest. But what truly paralyzed him was the sight of her holding that baby, perhaps 6 months old. The way she smiled at the child, with a sparkle in her eyes that he knew well. The same sparkle that had gradually faded during their marriage, with each failed attempt to conceive. William stood frozen, watching the scene. His mind raced with 1,000 questions. Was that her child? Had she managed to fulfill her dream after they separated? The thought stirred a mix of jealousy, resentment, and a pain he thought he had moved past. When he finally mustered the courage to approach, Emily looked up. The look of surprise and discomfort on her face hit him like a punch to the gut. "William, what are you doing here?" Her voice came out softer than usual, almost a whisper. "I came for a meeting with the board," he replied curtly, but his eyes couldn't look away from the child. Is this your son?" The baby turned his face at that moment. He had large, dark eyes, and something about them made William feel something inexplicable. A recognition, a connection that made no sense. "No," Emily answered quickly. "This is Matthew. He was found at the emergency room doors 2 weeks ago. I'm taking care of him temporarily, until they decide his future." "Found?" William furrowed his brow, looking more intently at the baby. "What do you mean?" "Someone left him here, with just a blanket and a note asking us to take care of him," explained Emily, adjusting the little one in her arms. "Since I'm the head of pediatrics, I took temporary responsibility. He's under the hospital's custody while the Child Protective Services sorts out the situation." William observed how naturally Emily handled the baby. It was as if she was born for it. The pain he felt was almost physical. He remembered the nights he found her silently crying after yet another negative pregnancy test. How helpless he felt, unable to give his wife what she wanted most. "Dr. William Thompson?" A voice interrupted his thoughts. It was the director's secretary. "Dr. Henry is waiting for you." William nodded, but before leaving, his eyes met Emily's one last time. There were so many unspoken things in that gaze, so many unhealed wounds. "It was good to see you, Emily," he said finally, with the formality that two strangers who once shared the same bed might have. "Likewise, William." Throughout the meeting with the hospital director, William couldn't fully concentrate. His mind kept returning to Emily and that baby. There was something about that child, something in her eyes that unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. When he returned to his apartment on Fifth Avenue that night, William found his mother, Mrs. Elizabeth, who had insisted on preparing dinner for him. At 68, she still maintained an elegance and poise that commanded respect. A widow for 5 years, she devoted herself entirely to social work and spoiling her only son. "You seem distant, son," Mrs. Elizabeth observed as she served dinner. "Problems with the hospital contract?" William took a sip of wine before responding. "I ran into Emily today, at the hospital." Mrs. Elizabeth froze for a moment but quickly regained her composure. "Emily? Your ex-wife? I didn't know she worked at St. Clair's." "She was transferred there 6 months ago from what I understand," explained William, idly playing with the food on his plate. "She was holding a baby. For a moment I thought that it was her child," Mrs. Elizabeth finished, her tone one William couldn't quite decipher. "Yes, but it's not. It's an abandoned child under the hospital's care." The silence that followed was heavy, thick with tension. William noticed his mother suddenly seemed uncomfortable, avoiding his gaze. "Mom, is everything okay?" Mrs. Elizabeth set her utensils down on the table with excessive care. When she finally looked at her son, her eyes were glistening. "William, there's something I need to tell you, something I should have said a long time ago." Dinner at the penthouse on Fifth Avenue had lost all meaning. William stared at Mrs. Elizabeth, who now trembled slightly as she tried to find the right words. The luxurious apartment with its panoramic view of New York suddenly felt claustrophobic. "Son, there's no right time to say this," Mrs. Elizabeth began, her voice steady despite the obvious anguish. "Your father and I, we tried for years to have a biological child. When we finally accepted it wasn't possible, we decided to adopt." The words hit William like a bolt of lightning. He felt his entire body go cold. What are you talking about?" The question came out almost as a whisper. "You were adopted, William, legally, completely, with all the love in the world. You were just 3 months old when we brought you home." The silence that followed was deafening. William stood up abruptly, knocking over the wine glass onto the white tablecloth. The scarlet liquid spread like a bloodstain. "Why are you telling me this now? Why did you wait 42 years? His voice was filled with disbelief and betrayal. "Why did my father never tell me anything? Why did you never tell me anything?" Mrs. Elizabeth remained dignified, despite the tears now streaming freely down her face. "Your father wanted to tell you when you turned 18. I was against it. I was afraid of losing you, that you would seek out your biological family and drift away from us." She took a deep breath. "When you married Emily and started trying to have children without success, I thought about telling you, but then you found out the issue was with Emily, not you, and I thought the truth would only complicate things further." William ran his hands through his hair in a gesture of despair. "Do you know how much this could have changed my marriage? How much it could have helped Emily understand she wasn't alone in that situation?" "I know," admitted Mrs. Elizabeth. "I made a terrible mistake. When your father fell ill, he wanted to tell the truth, but I convinced him to wait. After he passed, I carried this secret alone. Today, when you mentioned that baby and the way you looked at him, I realized I couldn't delay any longer. William walked to the window, gazing at the city lights. Who was he, after all? His entire identity, everything he believed about himself, his family history, his legacy, all of it was built on a lie. I know all about your origins, Mrs. Elizabeth continued after a moment. I have the documents saved. Your biological mother was very young, from a humble family in Miami. She wasn't in a position to raise you and chose legal adoption. She only wanted you to have opportunities she couldn't provide. Miami? William turned, surprised. A shiver ran down his spine. His company's expansion was precisely focused on the Northeast. Yes, that's where your father and I found you, through an adoption agency. It was a simple place, but very organized and ethical. We brought you to New York and registered you as our son. William felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. Miami. The most important project of his career was taking him back to his roots, without him even knowing. I want all the documents, now. His voice came out harsher than he intended. Mrs. Elizabeth nodded, rising with dignity. They're in the safe at my apartment. I can bring them tomorrow. No, we'll go get them now. An hour later, sitting in his father's old office in the apartment where he had grown up, William opened a yellowed folder containing his adoption documents. Certificates, statements, medical history, everything was there, preserved like a forbidden treasure. Among the documents, he found a handwritten letter. It was from his birth mother, addressed to his adoptive parents. William read it with a racing heart. Dear Sir and Madam, who will now be the parents of my son. I never imagined I would one day write a letter like this. I'm only 17 years old, and I know I can't give my boy everything he deserves. I want you to know this is the hardest decision I've ever made, but also the most selfless. I hope you can love him as I love him, that you can give him what I cannot provide, stability, education, a future full of opportunities. I only ask that, when he's old enough to understand, you tell him that his birth mother didn't abandon him out of a lack of love, but precisely because she loved him too much to condemn him to a life of hardship. With gratitude and hope, Caroline Smith. Tears streamed down William's face as he finished reading. Caroline Smith, your biological mother had a name, a story. She was 17 when she had you. She loved you. Why did no one ever tell me this? He asked, his voice choked with emotion. Why did you hide this letter? We were afraid, confessed Mrs. Elizabeth, seated across the room. Your father and I came from traditional families where adoption was seen with prejudice. We wanted to protect you from that. Over time, the secret became harder and harder to reveal. William continued examining the documents. One detail caught his attention. The recorded birth date was different from the one he had always celebrated. He wasn't born in August, as he had thought, but in May. His 43rd birthday had already passed without him knowing. You even changed my birth date? His tone was incredulous. It was to make the adoption process easier, explained Mrs. Elizabeth, avoiding his gaze. At the time, the laws were different. There was more bureaucracy. Your father had connections that helped speed up the process, but we needed that change to avoid questions. The revelation hit like another bombshell. His father, Anthony Thompson, the man he had always seen as a model of ethics and integrity, had manipulated official documents. The same man who taught him about integrity in business. William stood up, pacing nervously around the office. So my entire life has been based on lies. Everything I thought I was, I'm not. You are our son, William. Mrs. Elizabeth's voice grew stronger. The fact that you weren't born from me doesn't change the love we feel for you. It doesn't change who you've become. Your father was so proud of the man you became. The words didn't bring the comfort his mother had hoped for. William felt as though he was staring at a stranger in the mirror. Who was William Thompson, after all? A borrowed name, a fabricated identity. That night, William couldn't sleep. He kept going through the documents, searching for more information about Caroline Smith. Among the papers, he found a yellowed newspaper clipping from a Miami publication dated May 1982. The headline was about a support program for young mothers who wished to give up their children for adoption. There was a group photo, and William spent hours staring at each woman's face. wondering if any of them could be his biological mother. The next morning, William cancelled all his appointments. Sitting in his office at Thompson Enterprises, he analysed the expansion project for the Northeast with new eyes. It was as if fate was giving him a sign. Miami wasn't just another point on the map for his business. It was the place where everything began. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Olivia, his assistant. "Dr. William, I'm sorry to bother you, but Dr. Emily Carter is on the line. She said it's urgent." William felt his heart race. "Put her through."